All right, Audrey has dedicated her life to shedding light on human trafficking and the injustices taking place in our world, especially in conflict zones. She attended the University of Delaware, where she received a Bachelor of Science in Education. After graduation, she moved to Belgium with the Youth Adult Service Corps to work with international students and refugees throughout Western and Eastern Europe. While living in Europe, she learned of the horrors of human trafficking firsthand when the children's home she had been volunteering at was exposed as a front for prostitution. At the time, she was a charter board member for the organization, which helped close down the home. In an effort to rescue vulnerable children before experiencing the trauma of trafficking, Audrey has worked since 2005 to support the foundation and expansion of the only indigenously directed anti-trafficking network that today spans Sudan and South Sudan. In 2018, Audrey became CEO of Lift Up the Vulnerable and leads the mission of preventing trafficking and empowering change makers in war-torn communities. Audrey is also an associate member of our club, and we look forward to your presentation. Audrey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being a part of this conversation. It's an honor for me to be able to present to this group and know that we're in a lot of peers of like-minded individuals who want to see the end of exploitation. This is going to be a real high-level presentation since there's only 20 minutes. It's hard to get into the nitty-gritty of human trafficking in war zones in a short amount of time. But what I want to do is walk through our mission and approach, what's happening where we work, and give a story-based example to help put a face to what preventing human trafficking in a war-torn country is like. So Lift Up the Vulnerable is on a mission to prevent the trafficking and oppression of children and women, and then empower and uplift them to be agents of change in their own lives and communities. And as everybody here knows, at its core, human trafficking is the exploitation of a person's vulnerabilities. And in war zones or conflict zones like Sudan and South Sudan, where we work exclusively, children and women are at highest risk of being exploited through sex trafficking. And this takes place both abroad, recruitment, moving people abroad, and locally in restaurants, hotels, brothels, and urban centers. And also women and children are kidnapped by military and militia groups. And so in these nations, rape is a weapon of war. And that's a common practice. Also domestic servitude, again, especially women and girls, particularly internally displaced persons or IDPs, which if you're not familiar with that term, they have been displaced from their villages, but instead of being a refugee in another country, they are internally refugees. So they are in their nation, but no longer in their communities of origin. And labor trafficking is really prevalent, forced begging, gold mining, cattle rearing, brick making factories, street vending, rock breaking, delivery cart pulling, and agriculture, and beyond. But these are some of the larger industries of sorts that use especially children, but exploit people who are very vulnerable. And then there is child and early forced marriages. So child brides are very common practice, and kidnappings for adoption, and child soldiers. So, it's a melting pot of mayhem because, and we'll get into the history a little bit of South Sudan, but there are just so many factors and ways that a person can be exploited, and some more than one. So in the 2022 TIP report, in Sudan, there were reported at least 300 child soldiers in Darfur being used by unidentified armed groups. And in South Sudan, upwards of 19,000 children were being used by the government and opposition affiliated forces. So it is very much embedded into even how the government operates in both Sudan and South Sudan and the armed forces that they represent. Now, exploitation is especially prevalent in these countries, and this is one of the reasons why we're working here, because of the conflict and the extreme poverty that conflict brings about. So there's rampant orphanhood and large populations of unaccompanied minors from both Sudan and South Sudan, and also from neighboring countries in West and Central Africa who have fled. There are many people crossing over from the Ethiopian border, and I'll show you a map soon so you'll see where we'll put it in context. But there are just a lot of people, and especially children, who don't have any protection at all and nowhere to go for help. There's also civil unrest. And so due to regional instability, again, from the TIP report from 2022, they named that there are more than 3 million internally displaced peoples in Sudan. And in South Sudan, 1.3 million, or upwards of 2.3 million South Sudanese refugees living in neighboring countries. And so this massive movement, because of the conflict, just dismantles the community safety nets that can be provided when people are able to grow and live and thrive in peace. But then it's just a massive area and a great number of people to be exploited by traffickers. And we'll name some of the cases in the coming slides. But also there's religious persecution, there's ethnic persecution, there's lack of access to education, lack of access to medical care, and even lack of access to food and clean water. So all of these are compounding, and it's hard to imagine how to endure. Our focus at Lift Up the Vulnerable is prevention. Now, we do provide aftercare for survivors of human trafficking, but prevention is our aim. And because we want kids, especially, before they have to experience the horrors of human trafficking, to be safe. We want to be on the front end of understanding what those root causes are. And the reason our work is effective, and we've been doing this now for almost 20 years, and building this anti-trafficking network, is because of people like James Lawalatok, who's featured here. We work with local leaders to identify and address the root causes and what factors are that we can grow and invest in to support children who have been left behind. So we're working at a very, very local grassroots level to build solutions for equipping and driving positive change. And that means our solution begins by identifying the root causes of exploitation in the communities where we work. Now, it's not always conflict. So when we first started working in South Sudan, it was the height of the Darfur genocide. And there were a lot of people that were fleeing into where James, the man from the previous picture, was, into his community they were being displaced from the Darfur region. And the children in his communities were survivors of conflict, and their families had been attacked by Darfuris. So it's a complicated scenario to navigate. But what we want to do is be there, even after conflict passes, be there for the building up of those communities when it is safe to do so. So we prevent human trafficking with a real agile approach that, we address extreme poverty, we're addressing instability and lack of infrastructure and resources, which leave, again, millions and millions in Sudan and South Sudan vulnerable or exploited. And so our three kind of areas that we're doing that is through protection, education, and economic development. And using those three models or three programs to instill support for those that have been left behind. And to me, this is the Rotary area. This is where it gets really interesting, because Rotary 7 areas of focus, I'm not sure if you're aware of these are all needed in preventing human trafficking. And all of these are really important approaches for us in our anti-trafficking work, because they are addressing the barriers that people face in the communities that we work, and also both nations at large. So if you do any one of these or do many of these, you're doing preventative work, because you're providing for people's fundamental needs and fundamental rights. And so I think that's really interesting, even as each of us have our own areas of focus, but as a club in general and part of the International Rotary organization, we are doing preventative work, even if we may not know it or name it as such. So let me put it in context. I've named Sudan, Sudan. This is where we are. Not everyone knows where Sudan and South Sudan are. So this is the continent. Sudan is this darker gray, and South Sudan is this lighter gray. This is Egypt, Kenya, so some areas for your context. Has anyone on this call, I won't be able to see all the hands, but has anyone ever been to South Sudan or Sudan? I know this is a very international group.
Hey, Audrey, I've been to Uganda. I've not been to South Sudan, but I saw several settlements from South Sudanese in northern Uganda, which is where I was.
There are a lot of refugees that go to Uganda or Kenya. There's huge settlement camps there. So when Sudan was one nation, it was 3 times the size of Texas. So it's it was a huge country, it was one of the largest countries on the continent. And our programs are in these 3 pink dots. So our anti-human trafficking network spans both countries, but our centers are very far from each other. So it looks really close, but they're hundreds and hundreds of miles from each other. So they don't necessarily work together. They're in very unique communities working with very unique tribes. And logistically, we also have operations in Kenya to help make things happen, because Sudan and South Sudan have been engaged in the longest civil war on the African continent, nearly 5 decades. In 2011, South Sudan became an independent nation, and then in 2013, violence re-erupted in South Sudan, and there's ongoing bursts of tribal conflict that continues today. It's not all places. There has been a lot of work to build peace, but there is so much instability. And South Sudan, I don't know if any of you saw, but the Pope and an ecumenical group just recently went to South Sudan to help be a bridge for peace. And it was a wonderful effort to help in that area. But South Sudan and Sudan remain 2 of the hardest places really to work and to live. And at Love, our mandate as an organization is we're here in particular because we want to go where children and women are most vulnerable to trafficking, and where there's little to no other help available, because it's either too expensive, it's too dangerous, or it's too remote. So this is our MO, this is why we're here, specifically working to support those who are leading the way for change in their communities. And we first started working in South Sudan, I mentioned earlier, in 2005, at the height of the Darfur genocide, when an organization partner said, if you want to go where human trafficking is worst, you need to go to Sudan. And really 18 years later, as you've heard now, that guidance still remains really true. So our anti-trafficking network, these 3 dots, really are more, they're starting an oasis of hope. And I have a very hopeful attitude, even though it is so dire. I have a very hopeful attitude for what can take place in war-torn countries when the world and the communities gather together to protect those who are vulnerable. And when we first started working in Sudan in 2005, children in our program who drew these photos were experiencing raids upon their villages where family members were tortured and killed and kidnapped. And it left behind a huge orphan and refugee and IDP crisis with little to no support or resources or opportunity for care. And I can share a lot of different stories or give you access to a lot of different stories. We put a lot on our website, but I'm going to feature today one young woman because her story is very much the story of many in our program. And so when our work first began, every person in the community knew someone who had been trafficked. Every person knew someone who had been trafficked or killed. That's a lot, including Beatrice. And we have permission to share her story, but her name is hidden. So during a raid on Beatrice's village, her parents were killed by the Janjaweed, which was a militia group that was ravaging the area. And that literally means devil came on horseback when you do the translation. And she had remained safe by staying with her aunt. And her aunt did not have the means to care for herself and for a small child. So Beatrice was experiencing the trauma of violence, the loss of her parents, destruction of her village, massive food insecurity, lack of access to safe drinking water, food, all the things, all basic needs and rights were taken from her. And in instances like this, children like Beatrice simply have nowhere to go for help and are often left to fend for themselves. And that's when, in addition to the trauma that they've experienced, they become real targets for further, deeper exploitation. So it's after the raids and after the violence that we began to intervene and stand with the world's most vulnerable children. And we first do that through protection. So we ensure that vulnerable children and women are empowered to thrive long-term by first offering protection and other basic necessities like safe housing, nutrition, clean water, and medical care. And our protection programs at all locations are deeply linked to identifying children who have no other options and no other place to go. So in the beginning, children like Beatrice were sleeping in trees at night, simply to avoid hyena attack. So not only is the human world around them unsafe, but the physicality of nature, of where they're living in the Sahara Desert is unsafe. And so sleeping in trees at night, and can you imagine how hard that would be? And with the help of our partners, safe housing became our first priority. It also became the first home for girls like Beatrice. So this is the very first home that we built in 2007. And since then, our safe housing program has grown to these three other centers, and we're today housing about 600 children, both boys and girls, because boys are also vulnerable to exploitation. And they now have a safe place to belong and play and ultimately to thrive. And I always get asked, well, how do you protect them once they're here? Because it seems like they would be prone for attack. And that hasn't happened yet. We've been doing this work for 20 years. And when we work really hard at the community level to build support, and thus far, the community knows that these children are their children and they want to keep them safe. It's the ones that don't have any support at all that are most easily trafficked. They just have, nowhere to go for help. But we also recognize by doing this work that family-based care models have been proven more effective than facility-based care. So we've begun piloting programs to help support family members to keep everybody safe together. So those that live with us currently have nowhere else to go, but we're starting to invest at the community level with other engagement opportunities, and that's very linked to our economic empowerment programs. But once safety is established for children like Beatrice, we then focus on education. So education is a little bit unique, and our work is building up preschool through high school. Because of the conflict and the breakdown of infrastructure, 70% of school-age children do not have access to education in South Sudan. So this, just by not having a safe place to go and not being educated, puts children at higher risk of exploitation. And an unfortunate statistic is that it's more likely for a 13-year-old to die in childbirth than to learn to read and write in South Sudan. So lack of access is key, and therefore restoration of equal access is the solution. And we have been working with, at our 3 schools, we have the preschool all the way through high school. And we also are building up community-wide education on why keeping girls in school is important for each child, for their families, for their communities, for their economies, because girls are especially not welcomed in the school programs by and large, and don't have access. And so in addition to trafficking prevention, our aim is to see a new generation of educated peacemakers, because they will become the ones that lead for healing and hope in their communities. In 2016, Beatrice was the first high school graduate, was part of our first graduation group. And since that time, we've had 199 students graduate from our high school programs, which is really great. And this year we'll have another cohort. Every year, every cohort gets a little bit bigger in the following years. And our third and final pillar is economic development. When there is access to education and economic development opportunities, the temptation to leave, and especially in this context, the stability becomes much lower. So access to sustainable opportunities increases families' development, communities' development, and they will be less likely to fall prey to lies of traffickers. Just last week, there was a case I read about in Interpol that a notorious people smuggler known for his particularly cruel and violent treatment of migrants, and I could pop this link in the chat in a moment, but he was arrested in Sudan, and he was known for trafficking victims from East Africa in the context of work abroad. But there was thousands of people that are suspected of being kidnapped, murdered, extortion, involved in this trafficking ring to Europe. So it's, if we can keep economy local, many people will benefit. And so we're investing in economic development like agriculture training and vocational training. And we provide jobs for nearly 200 local leaders who are then equipped to support their families, even as they support the kids in our programs. And we also are committed to helping students that grow up in our anti-trafficking network find the opportunities to thrive post-graduation through vocational training and university. So Beatrice, with the longest hair, is a pioneer in our network, and she was the first protected, the first to graduate high school, and the first to go through our economic development initiatives. And she graduated nursing school in 2020 and is now living independently and finding ways to serve her community. So it is difficult to do work in this context, in these countries, but there is hope when we equip local leaders to support those who are vulnerable. We're finding that we have a lot more to do. There's a lot of people that have a lot of needs, but with these early steps, we are finding our way. So I'll pause now. I think that's my time, and I'll leave for questions.
Just what is the month of love?
Is
this February?
It's February.
Valentine's Day. Okay.
So we celebrate the International Day of Love, also known to you as Valentine's Day. And all month long, we are doing fundraising activities and promotional activities to learn more about human trafficking and how people can really take practical steps to be a part of the solution. Thank you for asking.
Audrey, what's the predominant language? Is there one predominant language in this particular village?
There are predominant languages in the 3 villages, but they're all different from each other. So in where we first began working, the predominant language, it's the Dinka tribe, and Dinka was the tribal language. In the Nuba Mountains, we also work in Sudan, and Arabic and the Nuba local dialects are predominant. And where we work in South Sudan, along the border of Uganda, there are, at our centers, there are actually 20 different tribes that live there. So the common languages that they share are English and Arabic. South Sudan, or Sudan, was colonized by Great Britain. So English is a learned language. And then it was colonized by Arab speaking communities. And so Arabic is also a learned language. So we share common languages in Arabic and English.
I'd after this conversation, like to get together with you. We'd like to support you in regards to our training courses for the students.
Great.
And there might be some translations that we can help do together, but I'd like to do that.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that.
Have you read the book, What is the What?
I have, actually, yeah.
Just for people to know, this is about two of the warring factions in South Sudan. And just for a sidebar, I do know that it's sort of the good guy and the bad guy. And I know somebody from South Sudan who's from the other side, and they're both good and they're both bad, but the book is still quite, this is according to my friend from South Sudan, but it's a good book called What is the What? I have a copy right here, but if anybody's interested in hearing, just drop me a note. Audrey, you can give your opinion from what I just said.
Yeah, I read it probably in 2005, so I don't have a strong opinion anymore.
It's been a while, but 2010 for me. So yeah.
A good one that also, if you want to learn more about trafficking in Sudan, is called Slave. And it is a story of a young woman her village was raided. I'll let you see that title. Her village was raided and she was taken into slavery. She was from the Nuba Mountains, which is along the border of South Sudan, and she was taken into slavery doing domestic servitude in the Khartoum area, which is the capital of Sudan. And it's her experience. And it's a really beautiful and powerful book. So Mende Nazar and Damian Lewis.
Audrey, I recently started doing some presentations online for South Africa and Kenya and some other locations, and I'm often surprised at how little general awareness there is of this topic. Are you finding that in other locations? In Asia, because there is so much emphasis on the topic, you can go to many places and you'll have them say, yes, I've heard about this. But in Africa, and to a certain extent in parts of Latin America, I find the same thing.
Yeah, I would say that is our experience, because it is so for 5 generations, 5 decades, people have just been living in this chaos. And so children working in gold mining is normal. It's the norm. Yeah. And so there's a normalization, there's a lot of trauma, but there is becoming more of an awareness of, human rights violations are known, but there's becoming more and more conversations in the community level and also in a more broader spectrum. But you're right, yeah, for sure.
Hey, Audrey, this is Karen. So I've been to a couple of countries in Africa, both Kenya and Uganda, and one of the things that has been a challenge for me as a Rotarian going in and just addressing, not necessarily trafficking, but other issues, is there's a real kind of divide from a tribal perspective. You know, even in talking to folks in Kampala about work that, you know, and Rotary clubs in Kampala, which is in southern Uganda, trying to encourage them to work with the work that's needed in northern Uganda. And because they're different tribes, they truly are not interested, even though they're all Rotarians. Do you see that happening is that a barrier to some of the work that you're doing in kind of creating that self-sufficiency within the local organization, I mean, local communities?
Yes, it's definitely a barrier. Tribalism is a very real thing in South Sudan, and it causes wars. So it is, and there's tribalism also is a causal effect for some of the trafficking cases that come place. There's a lot of kidnappings that are tribal based, or revenge kidnappings that will take place, and revenge murders. So what our partners are the leaders. So our organization works with three different nonprofits in Sudan and South Sudan, and each one has their own executive director and staff, and they all come from different tribes from each other. And it would be, sometimes they all work together really well because they are very mission minded, and we've built a culture of working together really well, but it's sometimes unsafe for some of them to go visit other locations because of the conflict or whatever's happening in the region. So the Dinka tribe is the majority tribe. They aren't always welcomed in where along the border of Uganda because of whatever's happening in the government. So it is a barrier. We can't. My dream would be to send some of our graduates to all the locations, but it's not safe for them yet. So it is something that we are up against.